And something probably everyone agrees on is that AI should be designed following ethical values and moral principles, but there are no practical and clear guidelines of how to do that yet. So, how should we implement ethics in AI, and how can we bridge the gap between philosophical discourse and practical application in companies? These are questions that our panelists of the next panel want to tackle. Carla Husted is the head of the Ethics of Algorithms project at Bertelsmann Foundation. She has consulted the German Parliament's AI Enquete Commission on the issue of algorithmic transparency. Also on the panel is Hiltrud Werner. She is member of the Group Board of Management of Volkswagen AG, responsible for integrity and legal affairs. Dr. Andreas Davis will be one of the participants. He is the co-founder of KIP Project, software for secure and privacy-focused data science and machine learning, and they will be joined by Professor Dr. Markus Gabriel. He's the chair of epistemology, modern and contemporary philosophy, and the director of the International Center for Philosophy at the University of Bonn. So quite an exciting panel. It will be moderated by AI consultant, author, and fellow podcaster Peter Seeberg. And let me hand the stage over to you, Peter, with something René Descartes almost said. It is not enough to have a good AI, the main thing is to use it well. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Also a warm welcome from my side to the Ethics of Algorithms panel hosted by KI Park Germany. KI Park Germany is an open AI initiative that promotes the application of AI in Germany. And if you, dear listener, have a specific question about how to apply and industrialize AI, or you want to learn more about the initiative, please visit www.kipark.de or join the keynote tomorrow at 5 p.m. For now, we are going to address our ethics of algorithms from a theoretical discussion to practical application topic. We're going to do that along a guiding question, which is, are algorithms biased? And I'm going to start with you, Markus. For a starter, please tell us what is ethics, and therefore what is ethics of intelligence?
Well, in general, ethics is the philosophical discipline which studies the nature of moral facts and principles. Moral facts are facts about what humans, insofar as we are humans, ought to do or not to do. What we absolutely ought to do is what we call the good. What we absolutely ought not to do is what we call radical evil, and the rest lies in between. And so the discipline of ethics tries to figure out what that is. So how universal value can be discovered in tandem with different disciplines. So ethics in the 21st century can only proceed in a transdisciplinary fashion, including, of course, politics, society, and the business world. So that's what we do in the discipline of ethics. Now, AI needs an ethics for the simple reason that AI systems are used in the context of human-machine interface systems, such as companies, news feeds, etc. Right? We have all these applications, and these applications structure data in a certain way, and therefore, right, make it more likely that a certain decision will be taken or some other decision. This is why AI systems are subject, or ought to be subject, to ethical considerations, and the future discipline of ethics of AI has just started.
Thank you for this introduction, Markus. Carla, what are the sources of ethical problems occurring in AI systems?
When we talk about algorithmic decision-making, I actually try to avoid the term AI because I feel like it gives a wrong impression of what these systems can do and what they cannot do. We also call them socio-technological systems for the reason that it's not just the technology that is the cause of bias, of mistakes, but it's mostly the human decisions that lie behind it. So it's the goals of the system. Of course, it's the data that goes into the learning algorithmic system. It can be the code itself, or it can oftentimes also be the way a system is implemented, the way it's integrated into an organizational structure. Because in many application cases in the health sector, education, society, relevant fields, it's still humans at the end that interact with the machine.
Thank you for that. We just heard in the hour before already from Merantix as the example of the medical applications. Moving to Hiltrud, do applications exist that should be excluded from the beginning for ethical reasons from the involvement of algorithms? I could think of in the case of minors, autonomous drones, elections, or in the pre-selection of applicants. Hiltrud, I see you still have your mute on. Yeah, you may want to start answering from the beginning.
We assume that this is the case, although I believe it needs to be decided individually for each specific topic. For the automotive industry, for example, we do have dilemma situations in traffic in which such codified rules, as you just explained, must not be applied at all.
Very good. And moving to our fourth participant, Andreas, do algorithms appear biased here and there because the responsible data scientist has selected the wrong or the non-representative characteristics, i.e. the features from the data?
Yeah, it's certainly part of it. I mean, if you look at, for example, supervised learning, where we want to predict a certain outcome, classical example would be hiring. So we have a machine learning system, for example, that tries to reproduce hiring decisions by people, and we train that system by giving it historical data, for example, so like hiring decisions that were made in the past, and maybe there was some part of these hiring decisions that were made because of discrimination, for example, against women or ethnic minorities, for example. And the algorithm basically doesn't know about it. It just tries to reproduce the decisions made by the humans in the process, and it can do that the better, the more data it has that can predict the outcome. And if this data includes, for example, so-called sensitive information like the gender or information about ethnical data, then this algorithm can do that better and can, of course, also reproduce this bias and this discrimination that was inherent in the training data. So in that sense, yes, but it always depends on what kind of data we feed to the algorithm and how easy we make it to also infer these sensitive attributes from the data that we have provided to the system.
Thank you very much there, Andreas. This concludes kind of our first round. As you as a listener will realize, it's not that easy in an online fashion to do a real discussion in between the members, but I do propose that with the upcoming questions that we have, that you do try maybe to answer, or if you have a different opinion in your answering of what you just had. So moving back to Marcus, will we ever get a strong AI, as according to John Searle, the Chinese room, that will think like humans and will eventually overtake us in terms of human intelligence, question mark? And if not, when it comes to the ethics of algorithms, should we maybe concentrate on the non-thinking, the non-understanding, i.e. the weak AI?
Well, yes, I think, like there I cite for very different reasons. The arguments are flawed in John's Chinese room argument, but so I don't think that there will ever be such a thing as what John Searle has called strong AI. So, human level or even super intelligent systems. The reason that I give for this, it's a very different reason than one that you get in the Chinese room argument, which is outdated given by contemporary AI systems. But the real reason is that intelligence is arguably a feature of certain living systems. Intelligence has evolved as the capacity to solve a given problem in a finite amount of time. For instance, you're hungry and therefore you need to solve that problem. And you have evolved in such a way to to select from a potentially infinite solution space the best solution. And you're more intelligent than some other system if you find the same solution faster, right? So we can measure that property and build models that replicate intelligent behavior in animals in a technical fashion. That's, I think, what AI systems are doing, AI research, right? And we have advanced way beyond the semantic kind of, or the syntactic engines that John Searle had in mind. But as long as our, systems are not literally based on neuronal biological material, which they're not going to be intelligent. However, in this sense, however, the real problems do not lie there. The real problems are in weak AI, right? As Hiltrud Werner has mentioned, certain dilemmatic situations which are not solvable, right? Because they're strictly dilemmatic, ought therefore to be avoided, right? So we have good reasons, for instance, not to go to level 5 automated driving in certain conditions for those ethical reasons, right? So automate as far as possible, but there are limits to automation, ethical limits, right? And I think this is what we ought to discuss. So the real impact of weak AI, for instance, pre-selection, algorithmic bias, new feeds, etc. And in order to do so, we need to understand the integration of weak AI systems in the human life world, because our intelligence has changed in the last decades. We have become more intelligent due to the use of those systems, because that's the real intelligence explosion. And we have yet to find a way of dealing with the fact that we have made our ethics explicit, right? I mean, we now know much better how we judge, because we can see patterns in those data thanks to the use of weak AI systems. This is, I think, where the action is.
Thank you very much for putting that perspective, which I personally can support. But nevertheless, I do propose that, and as you did, the other answerers members do maybe give their perspective as well. Carla, which organizations and which persons in the organization are responsible for the implementation of trustworthy AI? Is it the producers of AI system, the operators? Is it others?
All of them. Actually, like I mentioned before, the sources of the problems are multifold, and so are the solutions. So I think there are certain technical issues, of course, technical bases that lie in the hands of the organizations and individuals that build the technical parts of the systems. And of course, those organizations and individuals also need to communicate how the systems function, what they can do, and particularly what they cannot do, towards the people who then use the systems and the organizations who implement the systems. Because we frequently analyze cases where things have gone wrong with good intentions. And what we see in these cases is oftentimes that it's actually communication and misunderstanding problems between different stakeholders. And that the people who understand the social problems that need to be solved, like in the education sector, healthcare, security, police forces, they understand the complexity of social problems. But because of the narratives that arrive from Silicon Valley, from the tech sector overall, of technology being a simple fix for complex problems, they do not take the necessary measures to implement the systems well. Things like competence building among people using the system, things like transparency, which is not just a technical issue, but it's also about communicating towards the people affected. So what we really need is better communication between those different stakeholders, and all of them understanding their responsibility and the role they play in the ethical implementation of the systems. And of course, we need politics to kind of create the right framework to make all of this possible.
Okay, so everybody takes their responsibility within the ecosystem and needs to communicate. Hiltrud, how does that work? Trustworthy AI, working with more or less biased algorithms, we're talking about that today. What needs to be done so that we can get towards this trustworthy AI as desired by the EU Commission?
Yes, I mean, we have heard from Markus and Andreas already that trustworthy AI is based also on those who develop the algorithms. So some factors that need to be considered, and Carla mentioned that already also, is that we need national or better supranational institutions that set ethical standards for these algorithms. But what we also need is ethical training for developers and programmers of AI-related software, and we also might need, especially for developers and programmers of AI-related software in critical situations, some background checks. And we need pairing concepts that in the quality checks of AI look not only for technical, but also for ethical quality.
Very good, thank you for that. Andreas, today in Europe, it's my personal feeling, we experience a kind of a biased zone between the law on one side and morale on the other side. We are legally obliged, just as one example, to differentiate between men and women. But if AI systems will be going through certification in the future, will that mean that Europeans will become more thoroughly streamlined in their thinking and actions? I would say almost similar, like, let's take the example of China, but only on the basis of other values. So will that mean that eventually Europeans also would feel like Big Brother is watching?
Yeah, not necessarily, I think. I mean, what will definitely happen is that as we move to digitize more and more problems and more processes and use machine learning or any kind of decision systems really to govern them, we will like find or uncover a lot of the problems that are hidden now, because so many processes are still being done manually, and there already is discrimination today, there already is like bias and a lot of problems, but it's still largely invisible, I would say, because there's no data that is easily available to analyze them. And I think with like the further use of machine learning and data science, we will see more of these problems, and that will also allow us to think in a more structured way about how to solve them. And I think if you look at data privacy, we can also take that as a good example how we could do regulation in machine learning or AI, because data privacy or privacy in general is a human right. So we have to derive the European law, European regulation from this principle that privacy is really the right to every human. And then from this law flows, so to say, the requirements that we need to fulfill when we build systems, for example, that process personal data. And from these requirements, which are legal requirements, then we have the technical requirements that are implemented by the engineers. And I think for AI or machine learning, I don't see a reason why it shouldn't work like that, working from fundamental human rights to a legislation, to a law that can be applied then, and from this law, thinking about how we can do the technological steps to ensure that it is actually complied in Europe.
Okay, so working on GDPR as a good European example, so to say. Marcus, I come back to you. A little bit of a different topic, I believe very important as well. Shall the police patrol more in areas where there have been more crimes in the past? Shall crime be correlated, therefore, with residential areas, ethnicity, and eventually the human face? And even more general, shall we as humans involve in pre-crime, i.e. in predictive or preventive police work?
Well, these are some tough questions. So,
yes.
Like we know that predictive policing in complicated ways where, say Clearview AI, which is a prominent example in the United States, has been in use for almost a decade. I used to live in San Francisco, and, even back in 2013, or now you already have good apps, for instance, also for New York City, where which trace the, your probability of getting marked in a certain part of the hood, etc., right? According mostly to algorithms and earlier data. So this is already in use, not everywhere, of course. And this is highly problematic to a certain extent, because we do know that existing correlations between, a certain population, its socioeconomic conditions, and the probability of illegal behavior, right? That we increase the tie between those correlations. So, and this might then lead to forms of, for instance, racism. So racism, let me just say what the mistake is. I mean, there are so many things wrong with racism, but the fundamental mistake is that the racist confuses a correlation between the phenotype of a human animal and a certain kind of behavior, right, with a genetic explanation. That's what racism is. If you think that, white or Hispanic or whatever person does a certain thing because she has that phenotype, that's just a bad explanation for what happens in reality. However, there sometimes are statistical correlations between the phenotype of a certain population and a certain kind of behavior. But the explanation for this correlation is purely sociological, right? This is how you dispel, this is how you refute racism. Now, the problem with the ethical problem with predictive policing, in particular, the use of Clearview AI, which is also muddled with the American alt-right. So there are some particularly bad aspects about Clearview, but be that as it may, the general problem is going to be that you reinforce, right, these correlations rather than overcome them. But we shouldn't just criticize AI there, right? We should rather invent positive AI. So this is a business case for a system which precisely does the opposite, right? So why not use the method in order to go into a specific neighborhood where you measure these correlations and take appropriate ethical matters, right, decisions. So there's always a positive use. So predictive policing as it's now practiced is ethically harmful. but we can use the same algorithmic systems in order to do the morally good. And I think that we need to change the discourse, right, from risk assessment discourse, which is what we're mostly doing in ethics of AI right now, to applied ethics of AI, meaning ethical training in and by design. This is how we prevent the bad things from happening, not by, you know, criticizing them after the fact. But it is ethically harmful.
Sorry, Marcus, I need to jump in here just because of time. Did you want to finish your sentence at least? Sorry.
Go to the next person. I made the case. Yeah.
Yeah. Carla, do we need new norms, new laws for the digital age? And if so, what role can the algo.rules that you coordinated, developed for Bertelsmann Foundation play?
I do not think that we do need new fundamental rights for the digital age, because we're actually quite well set on this regard. However, what we need to question is whether the mechanisms we have currently in place to protect fundamental rights and freedoms, whether they still work in automated processes. And oftentimes that is not the case, for example, because oversight bodies do not have the rights, for example, to access code in certain situations, or they do not have the competences, they do not have the right amount of people to deal with increased efficiency. And we need to analyze whether these oversight mechanisms still work. We need a strong civil society that can take on the role of watchdog organizations that can spark a societal debate about all these questions that were just raised. I mean, it was said many times in this discussion now that the use of automation kind of forces us to have this discussion again, what's between the super evil and the very good. But what we see oftentimes is that when something goes wrong with technical systems, people say, okay, it went wrong, let's stop using the system, and then the debate is over. And we fail to actually take that opportunity. And in order to do so, I think it's really key to have the debate focus not just so much on like the economic questions, but really on societal questions. And to build a strong basis for that, we need competence building in society. We need civil society to become stronger and also interact in the digital sphere. And now I didn't answer the second part, our algo rules. They're actually very aligned with what I just said, because those are not rules that define what fair is or what's unfair in a certain situation, because that depends so much on the application case. But they rather give certain recommendations on how to deal with possible mistakes, for example, by making sure that systems, that people are informed when a machine is making decisions about them, or that a decision is explained to them, and that, for example, there's mechanisms for appeal. Questions of, again, IT security, of privacy are part of the algorithm. So those are mostly process standards rather than standards that describe the system itself.
Thank you very much, Carla. I had my beeper go off here. That means that we need to slowly but clearly move to our closing statements. And I want to start with you there, Hiltrud. I think you've all thought about, and you have your personal views that you're going to share with us now. One question that I want to give each of you with is that as I've been listening this morning to the rise of AI speakers, there was kind of a general, almost like a red line, which is always about we Europeans, we Germans, we Europeans, we make norms and we do ethics, while our American friends or the Chinese, Asian people start first doing things. So maybe if you do your closing statement, if you can, but you don't have to refer to this, this theme. So Hiltrud, starting with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what we have learned today is that we have to incorporate every stakeholder in our decision making and competence building of AI. And yes, the European Union has a very special challenge here, whereas a lot of development in China is driven by the government, or in the US it's driven by corporations. We can drive everything that we develop based on the needs of the people. And I think we have a good a precondition for that. We do have many ethical stakeholders in our society, from philosophers to theologians, and also a good supranational institutions. And I'm pretty optimistic that our ethical standards will serve the people.
Thank you very much, Hiltrud. Andreas, moving to you with your closing statement.
So for me, yeah, as you said, we heard a lot about how privacy and ethical concerns are holding us back in Europe, but I think we shouldn't really think about it in that way, because it's really not the case that we can only have massively successful products and platforms like, for example, Facebook and Twitter if we accept that they violate our privacy. And it's also not true that we cannot have AI systems, machine learning systems that automate a lot of things if we accept only surveillance or other paradigms like the Chinese model, for example, for exploiting and using personal data especially. I think what we have here in Europe is really a very good foundation in data privacy and human rights, and we should really make a use of that and see it as a strength, because we can see that not only in Europe, but everywhere in the world, people are actually craving for these things, for privacy, for being in control of the technology and not the other way around. And I think we can, if we can deliver on that, we will have a big advantage in terms of the competitivity of our products compared to the US and to China as well. So I would see it mostly as an advantage than a disadvantage what we have here in terms of privacy and our German angst, as some people said this morning.
Thank you, Andreas. Marcus, your perspective?
Well, I think of ethical value as constitutively universal and global. So sometimes some Chinese philosophers are morally more advanced than some theologians. So I think that is the global challenge for humanity. So I don't want to think about this as Europeans. If we come up with European values, they are therefore false. No value that is local can be an ethical value. So torture camps are as evil in China as they would be in whatever, in Baden-Württemberg. And that means that ethical value, if it exists, is universal anyhow. So if there's anything that we can do specifically here, it has something to do with societal training, etc. And let's not forget, there are way more professional ethicists of AI in the United States of America and all those big corporations than we even have professors of philosophy in Germany, right? So, or China. I know, for instance, people in the AI world in Shanghai, they're all fully trained, highly professional philosophers. So I think it's an illusion that we are leaders in ethical training. We can become those leaders for the reasons that are typically given, but I think it's also very crucial to see our own mistakes. For instance, we do have racism in our basic law, in the Grundgesetz, which is why the jurists are now changing it. And I think we should also start by criticizing ourselves rather than fantasizing about evil China or evil United States of America. They are not as evil as we think. The Chinese Communist Party is evil, right? But this has nothing to do with our Chinese friends.
Thank you, Marcus. Final words for you, Carla.
Yeah, thank you. I think I actually have some thoughts that connect very well to what Marcus just said. I mean, first of all, I think what Andreas said before, the ethical development of technology is not just something that's morally right, but I think it's actually the only long-term sustainable way to move forward with digitization, because if we do not do this without the trust of the people, it will definitely backfire in the long term. And secondly, I think when I look at the AI ethics debate, and I've been following the development of this in Germany and Europe for the past 4 years, and I'm happy that it's becoming like raising on the political agenda, but it's so urgent that we kind of move from all these buzzwords like transparency that can mean so many different things to concrete action. And that, of course, means that we do need to find ways to deal with mistakes that will always occur in these systems, that we find regulatory mechanisms that allow transparency, oversight, accountability. But it also means, and this is connects to what Marcus has said before, that we need to find a vision for what digitization means in Europe that is not just in contrast to what's happening in the US and what's happening in China. Because right now, digital policy making on a European level is often very reactive. It's always like one step behind. And the reason for that is mostly because we're kind of looking at the technology and then trying to fix the mistakes that happen, but we do not have a societal vision. And this is really key. We need to use technology kind of as a mean to dream, like we do with science fiction, but in the focus should be the change we want to see in society, not the technology in itself. We always need to see it as a tool at the end.
Thank you very much, Carla. Facebook, Twitter, and Google have all switched to algorithms that now moderate the content of their platforms instead of people. I sincerely hope that you, dear listener and a participant as well, have enjoyed me as a human being moderating this panel, although, as I suggested in the middle, it's not that easy to have real discussion come up. Let me say thank you to our participants and, of course, to you, dear listeners. I've been asked to make one final call to action by our sponsor, KI Park Germany, to share with AI practitioners and especially startups to participate in an AI ethics lab. So KI Park want to make ethical questions tangible for developers and bridge the gap between actual source code and normative ethical guidelines. A transparent open source project should help to shape best practices for AI practitioners towards an ethical by design framework. You want to join? Please drop KI Park a message or join them at Swapcard where you are at the very moment. I say thank you to our sponsor KI Park Germany, as represented by Deloitte, Investor and Celonis, as well as to Fabian and Veronica from Rise of AI for making this panel possible. Looking forward to meeting and seeing all of you next time.